Hello everyone, I'm Sugary Sweet and welcome back to my Shining Force 3 Scenario 1 Insane Mode Efficiency playthrough. So this is Battle 6 and we've actually moved on to a new chapter of the game. Although usually in Shining Force chapters are more a means of separating a game narratively rather than gameplay-wise. It is true that since the Force moves on to a different section of the continent that you lose access to some of the towns you had access to before. Although sometimes it happens in the middle of a chapter anyway, so it's not really unique in that regard. And since we did reach a new town, there was a town exploration section and quite a bit has changed on our units. But before I get into that, I'm going to have to go over something that's about to happen on screen right now. You can see that I'm actually saving and resetting the game. And that is basically because I am save scumming the game. Basically, I need to reset the game until I get a specific dodge from one of the units. And if you remember saving Hayward in 1-2, you could probably guess it's because of this NPC we have to save Irene. You can see that she's about to get a guard right here. I just need to force the game to get this one guard out of her and everything will be fine from then on. So this map is pretty well known among the Shining Force 3 community, at least the ones who bothered playing the harder difficulties in this game, as being basically complete bullshit, assuming you want to save Irene of course, because if you don't force this first block out of Irene, she actually ends up taking 8 damage from just this one hit. Goblins are a new enemy type and they hit very very hard. Irene's going to have at least 3 attacks coming at her, sometimes 4, depending on how you play the map. And if she doesn't guard at least 1 or 2 of them, most importantly this attack from the Goblin, she is just going to die before you can even do anything. Now, one thing I can do something about is placing Dontares where I'm placing him right now. If your Synbios has high enough agility, he can also do this role if you want him to. By doing this, I can draw in some of the Birdman enemies that are about to attack Dontares here. If I don't do this, the one on top of the crates often just flies down and attacks Irene, so she would be facing 4 attacks instead of just 3. And in that case, you would have to pray that she gets 2 guards instead of just 1. You might have noticed that there actually is still one more Birdman on top of the crates. But his AI is kind of weird. I don't exactly know what triggers him to fly down from the crates, but usually he doesn't bother coming down to attack you until several turns later. Anyway, this map otherwise is only moderately challenging. Saving Irene is really the one thing that frustrates the hell out of anybody playing this game on harder difficulties. And this is pretty much the primary example that people tend to point to when they want to say that Insane Mode in this game was probably not really well playtested. So, moving on from this, we're about to see Hayward use his first special critical attack, Ice Arrow, that he just learned at the end of the last chapter. So, just to quickly expand on critical hits in this game. As I mentioned before, going up in your weapon rank will let you learn a new special critical attack each time. And as soon as you learn a new one, your critical hit rate will go from 3% or so to 20%. And it actually increases by another 10% for each weapon rank you gain after that. So by the time you get to a level 3 weapon rank, you will already have a 40% crit rate just as a base. So obviously that's a pretty high activation rate just as a base. So that's why when people think of Shining Force 3, they often think of the special attacks in this game. Because not only do you gameplay-wise obviously see them very often, and you can even plan around them because of how fairly consistent they tend to be, but of course the other aspect of it is that you get this fancy animation that can look very cool. This game did come out in the era where they were just trying to show off all their shiny new 3D animation technology. So if you remember playing JRPGs from this era, like even Final Fantasy VII or something, you might remember all the animations being very long because they were so proud of their modeling and animation work. Anyway, later on there will actually be weapons that actually add another special, so you get to have 4 specials instead, and then you will have a base 50% rate while having that weapon equipped. And it's not very uncommon for a lot of the late game weapons to have a special attack attached, so getting 50% crit as a base is pretty common by the end game. So, of course, as I mentioned before, when you have weapon triangle advantage, you get another 20% crit chance. And if you're standing next to an archer, or anybody who gives a crit bonus, you get at least a 50% critical bonus from your friendship. So with the right setups in this game, you can get your critical hit rates close to 100%. And even in this chapter right now, even though Hayward has only 1 special so far and he has a base critical hit rate of 20%, you're still going to see him fire off a fair number of criticals because between the flying enemies, who he of course has weapon advantage on, which gives him another 20% crit, I've actually equipped him with a new accessory that I bought from the item shop during the town exploration phase right before this map, called the Loincloth, which gives him another 12% critical hit rate. I know I mentioned that accessories are kind of hard to come by in the early game, especially like because there's no accessory shop early on, but this particular item comes from a bargain, which is just a weird feature of the shops in this game. Sometimes they just like randomly offer you rare items, and normally when you play this game it might just be a nice surprise for you to just suddenly get one, but once you know how it works, it's easy to get it every single time. You just have to speak with the shop owner and then just exit out of the menu and do it over and over until they offer you the item. As for the actual damage from critical hits, they're actually pretty simple in this game. They just add a static amount of damage to your attack. Although there are a pretty large amount of crits in this game that add either elemental attributes or status effects onto your attacks. But for now, we just have the one ice arrow special, which, as you've seen, doesn't add a status effect, but probably very obviously it does add the ice element onto Hayward's attack. Although elemental resistances aren't really that important in Shining Force 3, with a couple rare exceptions like, casting wind magic on enemy flyers. But usually you don't have enough variety on a given character enough to really care about elemental resistances. So going back to the damage real quick, the basic critical hit in this game only adds 3 damage to your attack. So obviously it's pretty nice to have early game when the HP values are pretty low, but obviously that critical hit gets weaker and weaker as the game goes on. But Hayward's Ice Arrow does add 6 damage. And the critical attacks he's going to learn later on are going to deal even more damage, and they're going to be able to do a couple of pretty useful status effects as well. Okay, so here we're finally about to recruit Irene. You're not seeing this in this final edited video, but getting that one guard out of Irene takes a lot of resets of the game to happen. So it's definitely a very tedious task if you want to recruit her on insane mode, or even hard mode in this game, because even on hard mode, the enemies already have plus 50% attack. So the base dodge rate in this game is 1 out of 32, which is about 3%. And as far as I can tell, this game pretty much just randomizes the RNG rolls every frame of the game. As far as I know, there's really no RNG manipulation for this game, so you just have to reset the game over and over until she gets that one guard you saw at the beginning of the map. It's worth noting that this is made especially tedious in Scenario 1, because the soft reset mechanic in Scenario 1 sends you back to the title screen and you have to go through kind of like this short opening cutscene of sorts, where you have to talk to the wizard and the fairy at the loading screen before you can get back into the game. In Scenario 2 and 3, I believe, they changed it slightly so that if you hold the start button while doing the soft reset combination, it actually automatically loads your last save. So it actually becomes a lot more convenient to just save scum in Scenarios 2 and 3. So because of the combination of these factors that make Irene incredibly annoying and sometimes very time consuming to recruit Irene, a fair number of players have come up with some weird ways of trying to recruit her, but I think a larger amount of players just decide to give up on your insane mode playthrough just for this map, and they toggle it back to normal so they can recruit Irene. Or you can go for the more advanced strat of just letting Irene die, because she really isn't that essential of a character anyway, so unless she's your waifu or something, you'll probably be fine without her. Speaking of Irene's recruitment, you're about to see that Masqurin is going to duck back beneath the boxes that she used alongside Albright to reach her in the first place, but she's going to fire off a well-placed blaze tube before she does so. So what's worth noting here is that when you change maps in this game, you don't have to specifically use the change map command or the open door command or whatever. You can take whatever action you want on top of the tile that transfers you to a different map and it'll still transfer you anyway. So this is why Masqurin is able to take a pot shot at these enemies before ducking back in. Albright's going to toss his hand axe at the one that's weakened enough for him to finish off, and Irene is going to fill up the tile next to him because the Birdman that has been kind of just floating around here this whole time is finally going to come down and attack us. Albright and Irene are both going to duck back underneath the boxes as well in the next turn, but I wanted Albright to get that kill just for some extra experience and to build a friendship with Masqurin a little bit more. So Irene had to stay outside, otherwise when the Birdman comes down, he will actually combine with the Goblin to get a KO on Albright. So by splitting their attention that way, I can keep them safe for this turn. So by the end of this map, I am actually going to get Albright and Masqurin to a level 1 friendship bond. It's going to come into play pretty quickly, and it's just a generally useful bond to have because plus 5 defense on Masqurin is obviously very, very nice, keeps her from dying. Though obviously it's not as useful from Albright's point of view because extra magic damage isn't really going to help him. By the way, you might have noticed that I prefer to use Albright using his regular axe rather than his hand axe, even though the 1-2 range weapon, the hand axe, is actually 1 point of attack stronger than his regular axe. And the reason I'm doing this once again is because I want to grind up Albright's axe rank more than his hand axe rank. Even though the hand axe on paper is going to be the strongest weapon Albright has access to for a while, by the end of the game there are way more useful axe choices than hand axe choices. So it is, I don't want to say it's a trap for beginner players, but it is one of those things that you might regret later if all you trained was Albright's hand axe level. And I didn't quite mention this before, but in addition to getting special critical attacks when you level up your weapon rank, it actually increases your attack power with that type of weapon as well. And this bonus actually gets stronger and stronger the more high quality weapons you have access to. So for example, for Hayward, he just reached weapon rank level 1, and he's still using his starter wooden arrow, so that gives him another +3 attack. But if he was using one of the endgame arrows instead, he would actually get +5 attack. And this gap actually grows larger and larger as your weapon rank gets even higher, all the way up to a +15 attack if your weapon rank is at level 3 alongside a late game weapon. So getting certain weapon ranks is actually pretty important in this game beyond just getting some pretty critical attacks. So I'm 10 minutes into this video and I still haven't actually said what the goal of this map is. There's just a lot of things to cover. But this map is once again a route map. So it does introduce kind of an interesting challenge as to how you're going to route the enemies, which is why you saw me split the force up beyond just baiting those early birdmen so that they wouldn't attack Irene. The main group, of course, is taking care of the bulk of the enemies, and I only had Masqurin and Albright go along to save Irene. Obviously, Masquerin's group is going to have a little bit harder of a time cleaning out the enemies, and by the end of this map, it's going to look like Masquerin's side has way more enemies left over than I can handle. But the nice thing is that in this map, you only need to route the enemies in the main map. You really don't need to care about the enemies underneath the boxes at all. That's just a shortcut for you to get to Irene. Synbios obviously approves of my plan here because he gets a critical hit, while showcasing some of the best voice acting in the game. And for good measure, he even learns a new special attack. But anyway, I still haven't talked about the context of why the team even finds themselves in this weird situation, so let me go ahead and do that. So after the end of the last chapter, the team decide to travel to the city of Railhead. Because the Empire is hot on their trail, they really don't have a choice other than to try to make it back to Republic soil and try to figure out what to do from there. So they decide to go on this journey by going onto a thing they've heard of but they've never actually seen, called a train. Unfortunately, soon after arriving, many Imperial forces swarm the train station under the orders of Prince Aront. So the force was kind of stuck in town for a little bit, trying to figure out what it is they could do. So while they were in town, Dantares decided to play the role of the classic knight, and he presented the protect ring that he got from the ruins last chapter to their resident healer lady, Grace. And Grace has been making good use of it because it gives her a bunch of extra defense and heals her some HP if she ever gets hit. Grace decided to hit the town for a little bit and to show off the ring to everybody despite being a holy woman. And while she was out, she ate a very tasty cookie, and that increased her luck by 2 points. She was also able to find a power ink in the weapon store that is more befitting of a holy woman like her. So now not only does she actually deal more damage in melee combat than Albright can, she somehow also learned the ability to summon tornadoes out of nowhere. Albright, of course, also visited the weapon shop and got a hand axe while he was there. He decided that in order to be more useful to the Force, that he needed to get back to his workouts a little bit more. So he ate an entire chicken and then had a really hard leg day. So now his legs are as thick as tree trunks, and it increased his agility by 4 points, so time well spent. Eventually the Force met back up, and they realized there was another way they can try to get onto the train, and that is by sneaking onto the train alongside the cargo. So they decided to visit the warehouse where all the cargo is stored. So obviously when they were here, they got met with these guys, a bunch of bandits who were just trying to steal whatever stuff they could find. And while they were doing it, they also found another stowaway, who was Irene, but it's clear that she barely speaks the language of the locals, but she does pack quite a punch, so she beat up a couple of the bandits and made them pretty mad, which is why Synbios and company came in to try to rescue her. So going back to Irene, I know I said earlier that she's not a very essential character, but that doesn't mean that she's useless. In fact, Irene does have some useful qualities to her. As you could probably already tell, Irene is a mixed class. She can both fight and heal. Unfortunately, Insane Mode is a little bit hostile to her build. You can see that even our pure fighters like Albright and Dantares are having a hard time keeping up with the enemies. So a mixed class like Irene is going to have an even harder time. As you can imagine, she's kind of in this awkward position where she's like not that great at fighting and not that great at magic. But she does have a pretty interesting support pool that can make her pretty useful. So aside from the fact that you've probably already seen, she gets healer type experience in this game. So when she uses her heal spell or healing herbs, she gets the full 10 experience at least, as opposed to the minimum experience that anybody else using herbs would get. So that already is kind of useful in the sense that Irene will be gaining experience that is just her own, and she's not really quote-unquote stealing experience from anybody else. But obviously she's still pretty limited in this regard, especially compared to Grace. Irene's MP pool is pretty small, and her only healing spell is the basic heal. I mean, she can get up to heal level 4, but it's unlikely she'll actually reach that. But unlike Grace, she cannot learn Aura, which is the AoE healing spell, so that kind of limits her healing ability. However, she does learn 2 other spells. She learns Tornado and Resist. Like I said, her MP pool is pretty limited, so you have to pick and choose when you cast spells with her a little bit more. But her Tornado spell is especially useful in Insane mode because she's going to be punching for like 1 to 3 damage most of the time, and she's really not going to be hitting things very hard at all. So the Tornado spell is going to be very nice for her to be able to consistently do chip damage on enemies. And the Resist spell increases magic defense, so the uses of that should be pretty self-evident. In addition, Irene gives a similar support bonus as Grace. She also gives magic defense, just like Grace does. But instead of boosting magic defense and luck like Grace can, Irene actually boosts magic defense and counter rate. It's a pretty unsynergistic pairing of bonuses because you can't counter magic attacks in this game. But it can still be pretty useful once in a while, especially if you have a decent support level and you combine it with weapon triangle advantage. You can get a pretty decent counter rate. The final thing I think is worth noting about Irene is that she is much faster than Grace, and that can obviously be pretty useful. As you can imagine, having healers of different speed brackets can be pretty nice in case you need to heal between certain enemy actions and that sort of thing. So that flexibility is also something that Irene can offer. Speaking of agility, you might have noticed that my Grace is actually getting agility screwed pretty badly. She's still basically at her base agility stat, even though she has a agility growth rate of around 50%, which is actually considered a pretty low growth rate in this game. But failing the coin toss like 6 times in a row is pretty unlikely. But thankfully that allows Irene's high agility to stand out even more in this case. One final note I have about this map is that there actually is a very nice item on top of the boxes where Irene started. It's called a Healing Rain, and as you might have guessed, it actually heals your entire party at once to full HP. Definitely would have been a really nice item to get, but I just didn't have the manpower to send somebody up there before I finished routing the map. So that is Battle 6 completed in 11 turns. I'll see you next time.